2,000 people had gathered to watch the execution of America's most infamous criminal. The man on the gallows didn't look like a murderer. He was neatly dressed, well-spoken, and had spent his last weeks teaching fellow inmates Latin and Greek. But as the noose tightened, Howard Rulof spoke what would go down as the most bone-chilling final words in execution history. "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." The crowd fell silent. This wasn't the remorse of a broken man. It was the brazen defiance of someone who thought himself above everyone else, even in death. The executioner pulled the lever, and America's most intellectually gifted serial killer fell into eternity. But what makes this story truly horrifying is this. Howard Rulof had one of the largest human brains ever recorded, 1,673 km through of raw cognitive power. He spoke several languages, did groundbreaking work in linguistics, and could have been one of the great minds of his time. Instead, he used that immense brain to plan perfect murders. Hours after his execution, surgeons removed Rulof's brain and found something that would haunt scientists for decades. This organ, bigger than Einstein's, bigger than nearly any brain on record, had housed the mind of a cold-blooded killer who murdered his wife and infant daughter, then spent years manipulating everyone around him. Judge Ransom Balcom had warned authorities years before. "This man understands his rights better than you do, and will defend them to the last." He was right. Howard Rulof's extraordinary intelligence wasn't a gift to humanity. It became one of its most dangerous weapons. In this video, we dig into the terrifying true story of the genius killer, a man whose brilliance became his deadliest tool, and whose preserved brain still sits in a jar at Cornell University. A chilling reminder that intelligence without conscience can create monsters. Howard Rulof was born around 1819 in New Brunswick, Canada, to Danish immigrant parents. From early on, Edward showed an intellect that was truly remarkable. Languages came naturally to him: Latin, Greek, German. Each new tongue absorbed like a sponge. But brilliant minds can cut both ways. Without moral guidance, intelligence can become more dangerous than ignorance. By his 20th birthday, he'd already seen both sides of the law, working at a law firm, then serving 2 years in prison for embezzlement. Edward's first brush with crime taught him something important. Society's rules applied to ordinary people, but maybe not to someone with his exceptional intellect. In 1842, hunting for new opportunities, Edward crossed into upstate New York and settled in the small town of Dryden, presenting himself as a schoolmaster, a respectable cover for his real interests. But Edward wasn't satisfied with teaching. He studied botanical medicine under Dr. Henry Bull, learning about plants, herbs, and crucially poisons. Through Dr. Bull, Edward met 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, the doctor's cousin. The Shutt family immediately disliked the mysterious stranger. There was something off about Edward's charm, calculated, artificial, as if he were playing a part rather than feeling anything genuine. Despite her family's objections, Harriet was drawn to Edward's intellect and sophistication. In 1843, against all advice, she married him. The couple moved to Lansing, New York, where Harriet gave birth to their daughter, Priscilla. For a short while, it looked like domestic life might calm Edward's darker impulses, but normalcy was never his thing. As 1844 went on, Edward's frustration with their modest life became obvious. He talked constantly about grand ambitions, becoming a university professor, writing revolutionary works on language and philosophy, gaining the recognition his brilliant mind deserved. He pressured Harriet to move to Ohio, where he thought better opportunities waited. But Harriet, now a young mother, refused to leave her family. Her refusal triggered something violent in Edward. How dare his intellectually inferior wife oppose his superior judgment? Neighbors began to notice warning signs in the Rulof household. Edward's charm seemed brittle and forced. Harriet grew withdrawn and often showed unexplained bruises. Baby Priscilla was constantly ill and fussy. The breaking point came on June 22, 1844. Edward confronted Harriet one last time about moving to Ohio. When she refused again, he exploded, accusing her of an affair with Dr. Bull. As Harriet worked in the kitchen crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, Edward's fury boiled over. He grabbed the pestle and brought it down on her skull with devastating force. Harriet collapsed to the kitchen floor, blood pooling beneath her head. In that instant, Edward crossed a point of no return. But instead of panic or remorse, his brilliant mind snapped into analytical mode. He had a problem to solve, and his intellect would solve it. 3-month-old Priscilla began crying in her crib, an unreasoned witness. Edward never explicitly confessed to killing the baby, but he later admitted giving her something to make her stop crying. The infant fell silent, leaving Edward with 2 bodies and the need to craft the perfect cover. The next morning, Edward displayed the calculating intelligence that would define his criminal career. He asked neighbors, the Andersons, for their horse and wagon to return a wooden chest to my uncle. They watched as Edward loaded a chest and what looked like a heavy sack into the wagon. He told them he was heading east, but they saw him travel toward Kaunga Lake in the opposite direction. Hours later, Edward came back. The chest was still in the wagon, but the mysterious sack was gone. He seemed oddly calm, almost cheerful, saying he and Harriet would be traveling for a few weeks. For several days, Edward's performance was flawless. He kept teaching, chatted with townspeople, and showed no sign of distress. He could compartmentalize like no one else, discussing philosophy and literature, while knowing his wife's body lay beneath Kaunga Lake's dark waters. Harriet's family had heard nothing since Edward announced their trip. When worried relatives checked the couple's house, they found it in chaos. All Harriet's personal things were still there. Her clothes, jewelry, items she would never have left behind willingly. Then he shifted the story again, insisting she had gone away to visit friends. But the neighbors had seen him with that mysterious chest and sack. Suspicion spread quickly. Soon whispers turned into open accusations, and Edward's carefully crafted image of the respectable teacher began to collapse. Authorities pressed harder, and though no body was ever recovered, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Yet Edward, with his formidable intellect, argued circles around prosecutors. He used his legal training to poke holes in testimonies, to confuse witnesses, and to cast doubt on every piece of evidence against him. With no corpse and no direct proof, the jury reluctantly acquitted him. For most men, such a narrow escape would serve as a warning. For Edward, it was proof of his superiority. He had outsmarted the law, and in his mind, that meant he could do it again. Over the next 2 decades, Edward drifted across New York State, alternating between bursts of scholarly work and periods of petty crime. He lived with various women under assumed names, often abandoning them once their usefulness ran out. He dabbled in burglary, fraud, and theft, but what never faded was his obsession with his own intellect. He wrote extensively about linguistics, convinced he was on the brink of a revolutionary discovery in the origin of language. To fund this research, he increasingly turned to crime. By the 1860s, Edward was no longer just a disgraced scholar. He had become the leader of a small gang of criminals who trusted his intelligence to plan their heists. Among them were William Dexter and Albert Jarvis, petty thieves who saw in Rulof both a mentor and a mastermind. But while they chased money, Edward's motives ran deeper. He needed funds to publish his great linguistic work, a manuscript he believed would immortalize his name. In 1870, the gang attempted their most daring robbery yet, breaking into a dry goods store in Binghamton, New York. Things went wrong almost immediately. A night watchman discovered them in the act. In the struggle that followed, Edward shot and killed the watchman. His gang scattered, but Edward was captured within days. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him at the scene, his accomplices betrayed him, and the murder weapon was found in his possession. Even Edward's brilliance couldn't twist his way out. The trial became a sensation. Newspapers across the country called him the genius killer, fascinated by the paradox of a man with one of the greatest intellects in America who chose to wield it for destruction. In the courtroom, Edward behaved less like a criminal and more like a professor lecturing a class. He cross-examined witnesses with unnerving precision, quoted legal texts from memory, and delivered long speeches on his rights. But the jury saw through it. They convicted him of murder, and the judge sentenced him to hang. While awaiting execution, Edward returned to his old habits. He taught fellow inmates languages, discussed philosophy, and even dictated sections of his unfinished manuscript. To the very end, he seemed to believe that his intellect set him apart, that history would remember him not as a murderer, but as a misunderstood genius. On the day of his execution in 1871, thousands gathered to see him die. He remained calm, almost smug, as the gallows were prepared. When asked for last words, he delivered the chilling line, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." Those words silenced the crowd and etched his name into the annals of true crime forever. After his death, his body was taken not to a grave, but to a laboratory. Surgeons removed his brain, measuring its extraordinary size, far larger than the average human brain, even larger than Albert Einstein's would later prove to be. For scientists, it was both a marvel and a mystery. How could such raw cognitive power reside in a man who chose a path of cruelty and violence? His preserved brain was eventually donated to Cornell University, where it remains to this day in a jar, a grim reminder that intelligence without morality is not a gift, but a weapon. Edward Howard Rulof's story continues to haunt criminologists, psychologists, and historians alike. He was proof that intellect alone does not make a man good, wise, or just. In his case, it made him more dangerous than the average criminal, because his mind was not only capable of great discovery, but also of meticulous, cold-blooded murder. He could have been a scholar, professor, even a pioneer in linguistics. Instead, he became a killer whose legacy rests not in books or ideas, but in the glass jar that holds the largest, darkest brain in American criminal history. Edward Howard Rulof's story proves one thing: genius without conscience is not brilliance, it's pure danger. His preserved brain still stares back from a jar, daring us to ask, how many more monsters hide behind the mask of intelligence? And if you thought this was terrifying, wait until you hear the next story, where evil wore an even more unsuspecting face.